We're very happy to be here today with Diane Schanzenbach at the American Enterprise Institute, a colleague from the Brookings Institution right down the street at Massachusetts Avenue. Diane and I have been working together on a report on government data and official statistics and how important those are, along with AEI's Nick Eberstadt and the Hamilton Project's Ryan Nunn. Diane, thank you so much for being here to talk about our joint work.
Great to be here.
I think this is a great report, I think. Maybe one of the best reports ever.
Clearly.
So I thought we'd discuss the report a little bit, discuss kind of these issues about data in general, and have a good discussion, see where it takes us.
Excellent.
So the first question, people don't realize this, I think, but the idea of the federal government collecting statistics about the U.S. population has a very old pedigree in the United States. Would you like to say a few words about that?
Absolutely. So this goes all the way back to our founding fathers. So James Madison observed sort of at the dawn of our country's existence that data on agriculture, on commercial and manufacturing interests will be particularly useful to the legislature as they try to accurately represent people. And so we've actually named this document after his quote on this, where he says, that we want to collect this data in order that they might rest their arguments on facts instead of assertions and conjectures. So this
who can argue with facts over assertions?
That's right. And he recognized at that point that this would enable not only government to work more efficiently, but also it would enable the economy to grow.
And it's in the Constitution.
Indeed.
The Constitution itself mandates a census.
I know we both love the Constitution.
We do.
Yes.
And again, who doesn't? So this is a very old pedigree. The mandate for the government to collect statistics about the population is actually in the Constitution. The government does a lot of things. Not all of them are directly in the Constitution. You can go right there and read it. So this is obviously something the Founding Fathers thought was important, obviously something that we continue to think is important.
I could add that, the historians tell us that it was a uniquely American idea to have the government so involved in this. And again, just that it really helped us with comparative advantage.
And for decades and decades, the United States was really the
leader.
World leader.
Exactly.
And we've kind of slipped a little bit, which is sad, but maybe we can...
We'll make statistics great again.
Exactly. So people know that statistics are out there. They know the government produces statistics. But my sense is that there is there's not enough recognition about the many ways in which statistics are used, particularly by businesses. The fact that businesses rely on official statistics is something that I don't think gets enough recognition by the general public. Can you tell us a little about how businesses use these data?
I agree, absolutely. So the modern economy is very reliant on data. You hear people talk about big data all the time, and just accurate, timely data is necessary for businesses to make decisions about where to locate their stores, where to put their warehouses, all sorts of things about stocking shelves and so on. So a lot of data businesses collect on their own, from their own cash register receipts or whatever, and they are able now with computers to analyze vast quantities of this data to forecast like staffing needs and again shelf stocking requirements and so on. But alongside of this is this really complementary role that federal government data provides. And so this spans a range of things. So of course, all of the nerds are glued to our seats the first Friday of the month when the employment numbers are released and markets move in response to that. That gives us sort of an early signal of the health of the economy, and I think businesses pay close attention to that. In addition, something that not a lot of people know a ton about is the American Community Survey, which is a very large data set collected by the Census Bureau. It's got about 2 million observations. And so what that allows us to do is drill down into local areas and understand much about sort of local area employment situation, demographics, and so on. And all of that is very useful to businesses, again, as they think about how to target their goods, where to locate, where they'll find the labor with the skills that they need, and so on.
So we have some great charts and graphs and pictures in the report, and one of them shows the distribution of population age over the country, where there are elderly people.
Exactly.
And as a concrete example, a business wants to know what to try and sell in Florida. and they look and they see, you know, these counties in Florida, the elderly population is actually increasing. So we're going to put more goods there that kind of target the over 65 crowd. That's an example of a business decision that happens every day that couldn't be possible without official data that the business knows it can rely on.
And it goes even further than that, right? So we can not only look to see, you know, where the elderly, but, you know, what's their income level? Are they married? You know, how old are they in terms of elderly, and so on. So it's very rich data that's really useful.
It is, and it's free.
It's free.
They just log
well,
on.
Free to the user.
Free to the
That's
user.
right. No such thing as free anything.
So you mentioned some of the non-government sourced data, big data, cash register data, those sorts of things. This is a revolution, I think,
Absolutely.
in information. And there's an argument out there, which is that, okay, well, you know, when James Madison wrote the Constitution, it was not possible for a non-government entity to collect these sorts of statistics. But here we are in the year 2017, and technology has evolved. And if businesses are able to do all this themselves, why do we need the government to do it anymore? And I wonder if you could discuss the report's view of the relationship between public data and private data.
So we certainly think of these as complementary. And we think that government collected data can do a few things that the private sector won't do on its own. And in particular, I think of that as that government data is comprehensive. And that is that, you know, of course, businesses can only collect information on their own business, whereas government statistics will collect over a much wider swath of people. So it's comprehensive. It's also consistent. So in addition to being able to measure data quickly, also because we've been doing it over such a long time period, we're able to do things like, you know, compare things that have been consistently measured over time, whether that's the unemployment rate or that's the employment to population ratio or GDP. You know, certainly we're always trying to make those measurements better, but having this consistent, comprehensive data set over time is also very useful. And then third, it's very credible. So there are strong requirements around transparency that's imposed both by Congress and, you know, that the statistical agencies have really embraced. These data are scrutinized both by markets and by researchers. When there are mistakes, and of course there are always mistakes in anything that we humans do, they're corrected in a transparent and timely manner. And so the federal statistical agencies have this refined set of practices that ensure quality and impartiality.
And the objective is different. Right.
Absolutely.
So you know, when a business is collecting data for themselves, they're interested in what they're interested in. They're interested in how their business is doing, how it's interacting with their customers, how they can kind of chart their growth and receipts over a certain period of time, or whatever specifically they're interested in. The official statistics are designed to be nationally representative.
That's right.
So you can take this sample and really learn things about the population as a whole. So they're both very nice complements to each other. And I think the argument that sometimes is had that one is better than the other, or we don't need one and we do need the other, I think that sometimes misses the point. I think the point is that they really work well together, and they should be paired together and used together more often. But you can't really have one without the other.
Exactly, and there's a real public good aspect to this, that the government is stepping in and collecting data, making it available to potential users.
What is a public good?
Well, a public good, thanks for asking that, one of my favorite concepts in my economics courses. And that is, it's something that has use more than just to the individual who is collecting the data. So, you know, if I were a large corporation, I would be very interested in collecting demographic data on the neighborhoods where I have located my stores. But I would underinvest in doing that because you would get a lot of use out of that too. And so either I could do that in a proprietary manner, or you and I could decide to work together to sort of join forces in this. And you know, there are good reasons. Sort of the Econ 101 reason is you would try to undercut me and provide a little bit less money for this, and I would try to undercut you, and then we would sort of have this race to the bottom. It's sort of a perfect area where government can come in and say, look, we do need some sort of optimal level of information on this. We can make some smart public investments here and then provide information to both the two of us and to everyone else who needs this.
It's the kind of thing that if collective action were taken, there would not be enough of this.
That's exactly right.
Because one person's not going to front load all the cost, and when people start to work together, then nobody has an incentive to provide enough resources.
That's exactly
right. So there are
right.
things like this. It belongs in a category with national defense,
yes.
With other sorts of big things that the government provides, because you can't rely on private actors to adequately fund it.
Exactly.
Which may be part of why it's in the Constitution.
Indeed.
along with the military. We've talked about business uses. We've talked about how the publicly provided data are complementary with private sector data. You are the director of the Hamilton Project. I am the director of economic policy studies at AEI. Obviously, we do public policy for a living. These data are absolutely necessary to understand public policy, to understand how policy interacts with the economy, to understand how policy interacts with individual people and individual families. I wonder if you could say a few words about how the data are used in policy.
Right, so I agree. This is our bread and butter as policy analysts, that we have to use these data to try to understand the world around us. And so we did a whole chapter on this, and we had to really keep it tight to cut down that chapter, because we had just example after example after example of really important work done. I'll talk about a few of my favorites. So one is that you may recall, I think you were still in junior high when President Clinton signed the welfare reform bill. But so we switched his very pro-work policies, a big EITC expansion and welfare reform. And one of the graphs that we include in this document looks at, well, what happened in the short run in terms of did women go to work after the introduction of these pro-work policies? And you absolutely see that. There's a large spike in that. But then a concern that we have now, and I think our colleague Nick Eberstadt has been particularly on the forefront of this, is we're seeing labor force participation rates come back down, both among men and among women. And so being able to track those things over time, we can use sort of clever research techniques to tease out cause and effect. But overall, we're able to look at this and understand sort of this important part of the economy.
Absolutely. Other big things too that people talk about. People are concerned about family breakdown.
Absolutely.
People are concerned about what happened to unemployed workers during the Great Recession. People are concerned about the rise of food stamp rolls. People are concerned about so many things. It would be impossible to be concerned about these things if the government wasn't keeping track of beneficiary rolls, if the government wasn't keeping track of statistics about the labor market, if the government wasn't keeping track about the basic ways that these policies interact with people in the economy, with the economy at large. We just wouldn't know anything.
That's right. Then we would be forced to, just like James Madison, warned us, we would have to, debate based on assertions and conjectures instead of facts.
Yes.
We always like to quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who liked to say, everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. And I think that these government statistics really help us have some common language. You and I can debate all day about what the facts mean, or what the causes are the effects, and I enjoy doing that. But nonetheless, we can both agree that these are facts.
When we started working on this, I didn't expect James Madison would play such a large role in this, but there he is.
Yeah, I always prefer Hamilton myself,
yeah.
But yes.
Yes. So, one of the biggest users of government data, or at least one of the most important users, is the Fed.
Do you want to explain a little bit about how the Federal Reserve uses these data?
Well, sure. So the Fed has to decide where to set interest rates.
Yeah.
And this is an extremely important decision. There's a reason why it gets so much media attention and press coverage. The decision of the Fed to move the interest rate up a little bit or move the short-term interest rate down a little bit ripples throughout the economy. It affects the mortgage you pay when you buy a house. It affects the amount of interest you owe on a car when you go and buy a car. It affects business decisions. Most economists believe that by changing the policy rate, the short-term interest rate, the Fed can either heat up the economy or cool down the economy. And the Fed needs good information in order to make that critically important decision. Primarily, the Fed looks at two things. The Fed looks at the health of labor markets, and the Fed looks at the behavior of prices. And so if you see the rate of price inflation increase too fast, the Fed is concerned that inflation is going to take off and that it will harm the economy. They try and pump the brakes. If, on the other hand, the Fed sees that there's a lot of slack in the labor market, unemployment is high, participation is cyclically low, then the Fed will try to leave interest rates low in order to speed up the economy. And pull those workers back into the workforce. This requires extremely accurate information about the health of the labor market and extremely accurate information about prices, both of which the government collects. If the information were even a little bit less accurate, and the Fed were to make a mistake as a consequence of poor data or lower quality data, then that would cost real money. And so there's an aspect of government data that really is in investment.
Absolutely.
This isn't just writing checks to produce data, and if you were to cut the funding for the statistical agencies, you'd get a little less data, but you'd be spending less money. The decisions that are made based on data have enormous economic consequences. The Fed is a great example, but there are other examples as well. I think the Social Security Administration, for example, when calculating Social Security benefits, uses the Consumer Price Index. If the Consumer Price Index is mismeasured a little bit, that can result in billions and billions of dollars of misallocated payments. So there's a sense in which taxpayer dollars are buying data, and that's kind of a scalable thing. But the consequences of lower quality data have enormous economic impacts. So the data are obviously important, and we've talked about how this is actually a constitutionally mandated function of government to gather these data. But of course, the world was different in the 18th century when the Constitution was written. And today somebody might ask, well, we have all this technology, we have big data, companies are collecting data, we have electronic records and all sorts of stuff. Does the government still need to be involved in this? Why can't we just rely on the data that private businesses collect? Why can't we have a Kickstarter campaign where everybody chips in $5 and all of a sudden we have all the data that we would ever want? Economists have a good answer to this, and I think the answer is right, and I wonder if you would like to discuss that.
Sure, there are a couple of answers to that. The first is, we know that whenever people get together and try to, to find a way to sort of build something for the common good, there's incentives for some people to shirk. And so, we could say there's a Kickstarter campaign and we're each going to throw in $5 to improve, collect these data. But maybe I would prefer to take my money and go buy a really nice latte. And, so then I'm not going to send it, or maybe I'll just send you $1 or $2. And so every individual has, the incentive to do that. And so in economics, we've got a strong prediction that then we just won't be able to collect enough money to do this optimally. So we'll underprovide that.
It's a feature of the good, right? So if this good exists, then I can use it.
That's right.
There's no way to stop me from benefiting from economic statistics. The Fed's going to make decisions based on high quality economic statistics. I'm going to benefit from those good decisions. Businesses are going to make decisions about where to locate stores and what products to put on the shelves based on good official statistics. I'm going to benefit from those decisions when I walk into a store or when a new business opens up in my neighborhood, because the entrepreneurs know that people of my demographic are starting to move to Northern Virginia.
Exactly, and the important piece is that you and I are going to benefit from that whether or not I kick in my $5.
Exactly. So because I know I'm going to benefit from those things, I have a strong incentive not to chip in.
That's right.
Because I'm going to get it anyway.
And then you can keep your $5.
And then I can keep my $5 while still enjoying it. And the problem is that makes rational sense for me. It makes rational sense for you. If it makes rational sense for everybody,
that's right.
Then you end up with the idea that the Kickstarter campaign would work, the idea that we could rely on private businesses to do this on their own, suddenly starts to fall apart because nobody has an incentive individually to actually chip in. Another example of this is national defense.
That's right.
Everybody wants a military that can protect the country. Everybody wants police forces that can protect our neighborhoods. And it's impossible to stop me from benefiting from a good police force in my local city. It's impossible for me not to benefit from a really well-funded and well-trained military. That takes away the incentive for me to chip in voluntarily, which is why we think of national defense and why we think of police forces as goods that need to be provided by government, where government has to catalyze that collective action.
Exactly, because we all share the benefits.
Yeah.
Then we all have to share the costs. And that's very difficult, probably impossible to do with just voluntary donations.
There are other reasons as well, I think. So it's true that a big retail store has a strong incentive to produce good statistics about that retail store,
That's right.
about its customers, about its products, about trends in a local economy or wherever that affect the business. But that retail store does not have an incentive to provide nationally representative data that are true about the population as a whole, regardless of whether members of that population shop at the store, regardless of whether members of that population are affecting the trends that affect the particular business too. So somebody has to be keeping an eye on what is true and accurate for the economy as a whole and for society as a whole, and businesses just don't have an incentive to do that. Now, the incentives that businesses do have to collect data about their own activities provide a wealth of really useful information that can complement official
Absolutely.
statistics and vice versa. So the official statistics are better because of what private businesses are doing, and private businesses are able to better gather data for themselves because of what the official statistics are doing. So we should think of these as complementary and not as one or the other.
I agree wholeheartedly.
So tell me kind of a quirky anecdote about data that we've learned from research that you think is interesting, that kind of illustrates an unexpected benefit.
There are so many things that that researchers have been able to tease out from this government data. So one of my favorite recent papers looked at the following event. So if you remember in the old days, if you were driving the New Jersey Turnpike, every couple of miles you had to stop and throw in your 35 cents to get through the toll. And there would be these long lines, and you had to make sure you had change. And you'd be sitting there idling for quite some time before you got to throw in your change and then speed off to the next one. So they replaced that with Easy Pass. And so no longer do you have to have your 35 cents, but then also you're able to speed through without having this big traffic backups. Well, of course, that led to there being less vehicle emissions in the air. And so what these researchers were able to do was see, well, how did the introduction of Easy Pass impact infant health in the area? And what they found was infants are born healthier, they're healthier as a result of not breathing in all of this smog. So consumers were better off because they didn't have to wait and find their 35 cents, but they were able to use this, so they're getting to their destinations faster. But then the public health is also better. So that's something we would not have known if it weren't for this.
Technology marches forward, data is collected, and we can find unexpected benefits.
Exactly.
So we've been talking a lot about how important official statistics are, how important the statistical agencies are, how important they are to businesses, how important they are to the policy-making process, how important they are to the research community in understanding the effects of public policy. And that's all true. But there are reasons to be concerned about the government collecting all this information. And I think the most important reason to be concerned about that is concerns about privacy. All this data comes from businesses and households filling out forms and putting personal information on there. And some of that information is extremely personal: how much money you earned, what your marital status is, other aspects of your family life. The statistical agencies take this extremely seriously and go to great lengths to protect the privacy of respondents. And I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
That's exactly right. These statistical agencies are very mindful that they have to keep the public trust to continue to do their jobs. And so they have very strict rules and laws around confidentiality. And in fact, the misuse of data is very closely monitored. And there's fines and prison terms for those who break break any of those rules. And in fact, when I have used these data as a researcher, they put you through extensive training and they warn you repeatedly, that this is a misuse of data, and by the way, then you will go to jail, which is a little bit daunting, as you think about it. I'm just trying to run some regressions here. But nonetheless, it underscores how seriously they take this. Some other things to add here is that this sort of information is protected. For example, it cannot be used against a respondent in the case of criminal investigation. And furthermore, it's important to note that almost everyone in these bureaucracies are career civil servants. So in fact, at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which collects information on unemployment and so on, only one political appointee works there. Everyone else is a dedicated career civil servant, and they take their jobs very, very seriously.
And by the time the data get down to the user level, it's been anonymized and scrubbed of
it would be
identifying
impossible. Certainly would be impossible to me to be able to misuse it, but nonetheless, they take this so seriously that they make every researcher go through training around this, and you really emphasize the grave consequences of any misuse.
So I think it's more than fair to say that the statistical agencies take this extremely seriously,
Yes.
and that the current safeguards are working.
Yes.
And in addition, they're always looking to improve the safeguards.
Yes, when we started this project, I spoke to a lot of people who either currently or in the past work for these agencies, and they all pointed me to various handbooks, very, very dense, thick handbooks that govern how the data are used. And I would not recommend to you to read those, but I have now done so, and what I can attest to you is that they take this very seriously. Confidentiality and impartiality are really guarded by these agencies because they know that's critical to public trust.
You want to talk about the unemployment rate?
Oh yeah, a little bit if we can. So one example of a government statistic that has gotten a lot of attention recently is the unemployment rate. And so, some people seem to think that it's inaccurate, misleading, a hoax, as sometimes it's been called. And I think what's important to think about here is the unemployment rate, or understanding the labor market, is sort of like that old parable about the blind man and the elephant, right? If you remember it, the one comes over and thinks that an elephant is like a tree because he measures its leg, and the other one thinks it's like a rope because he's holding his tail, and I forget what the ear guide thinks, but so there's just lots of different parts that make up an elephant, and indeed there's lots of different pieces that make up what the labor market looks like. So for example, we've got the payroll jobs count. That's the thing that comes out the first Friday of the month. Also the unemployment rate and labor force participation rate. So those two things are distinct, but they're both very important in their own way. So currently the unemployment rate has come back down from its spike during the Great Recession. It's down to 4.9%. But importantly, that's only people who say that they're actively looking for work, that they're part of the labor force. A very concerning development in the recent in the economy today is that labor force participation rates have been coming down. In some corners of the market, coming down quite dramatically. So for example, prime age men, and so these are men who we usually think of as they're working. The share of them that are not in the labor force rose from 9% in 2007 to 11% this year in 2017. At the same time, we're seeing more and more women dropping out of the labor force. So that's just a different piece to understand the whole that is the labor market. So I think what's important is there's not one piece that will tell the whole labor market story, but the BLS, when they collect these data, are working very hard at collecting multiple pieces so that then someone can step back and say, okay, well, this is what the market as a whole looks like, the sum of all these different parts.
There are a lot of things you want to know, right? So
Absolutely.
you'd want to know of the adult population, how many of them are trying to find a job or are working?
That's
how many
right.
of them are actively participating in the workforce? And we have a statistic for that. Then you'd want to know of the population who are trying to find a job or actively working, how many of them are not succeeding? All these people want to be working. We know that because they either are working or because they're trying to work. How many of them are in the trying to work category? And we have a statistic for that, which is the unemployment rate. You might also want to know, of the people who are working, how many of them are working as many hours as they would like to? How many of them are working part-time for economic reasons when they would really want to work at a full-time job? We have a statistic for that.
It's the U6. That's right. Yes.
There are all sorts of labor market indicators that are produced, and as you say, the right way to assess the health of the labor market is to kind of take a step back and look at all of these. The Fed chair Janet Yellen has referred to this as a dashboard approach.
Exactly.
And I think that's. That helps to get a holistic picture, certainly. It also helps to put some context around some of the criticisms of individual statistics. So there is an element of, it's not unreasonable to look at the unemployment rate and say that is not an accurate indicator of the overall health of the labor market. Maybe you think it is, maybe you think it's not. It's not an unreasonable view. It is unreasonable and wrong to say that it is a hoax or to say that it is a fiction or something like that. And I think the reasonable side of the coin is to say, well, sure, that's accurately measured, but that doesn't represent what's happening throughout the labor market as a whole, and we need some other indicators. Unfortunately, other indicators are there.
Exactly. And we do think that potentially the unemployment rate is getting to be a worse indicator over time, and that means it's all the more important to gather all the pieces together.
Yeah. So let's talk about moving forward.
Yes.
The economy is changing, society is changing. How should the federal statistical system, how should official statistics keep up with that?
Oh, sure. There are many challenges that we need to face, and so I think of them in a couple of different buckets. The first is we really need to address some limitations in the data as they currently stand. So, for example, even though many people have gone to prison, we've seen a spike in arrest rates and prison rates, we don't actually have comprehensive data on who has a criminal record. So there's a lot of questions that we just can't ask or answer appropriately because we don't know what share of people or what individual people have a criminal record. Another example is I took Uber this morning, right? This has been a major change in how we interact with the economy, is the gig economy. And I think there's some good evidence that the data that we collect right now is not keeping up with these rapid changes in the labor market, and we need it to. And so I think we need to make some investments in there. Do you have any favorites that you want to add?
Well, I like those too. I mean, we have a changing society, and one of the features of society is that we have a lot of people who are out there in the world who serve some time in jail, and we think that there may be economic consequences to having been incarcerated. We think there may be social consequences to having been incarcerated. The data just aren't up to the job of allowing us to study that. The nature of work is changing.
Yes.
You mentioned Uber. There are a dozen other examples, and even among people who have what we would think of as old-fashioned jobs, telework is becoming much more common. Working from home, working odd hours, doing all those kinds of things. How do we measure that? How do we understand what's happening? How do we understand how policy is interacting with those changes? I think. At the agency level, there are other important ways to improve the data as well. It would be good if different agencies could combine and share data more readily. Of course, privacy is extremely important. You want to keep privacy safeguards in place, and you want to keep the statutory intent of these surveys firmly in place. But within that, there is scope for the agencies to learn from each other. There is scope to make all the data better and more accurate through some pretty simple sharing exercises.
I would add to that the potential to link survey data that the government collects along with administrative data is very important sort of step forward. So the reason that this has become such a big deal is that over time, people are less likely to respond to government survey requests. And they're also more likely to refuse to answer certain certain questions. And then third, they're more likely to misreport things like, they'll misreport whether they're on, let's say, the food stamp program. And so we can very clearly document that just the data have gotten less good over time. And so there's, I think, important work being done trying to link the survey data to administrative benchmarks. So that'll improve the accuracy of the data. It also actually could potentially drive down the costs of some of this, because it's very expensive to, to continue to pursue people who want to refuse to answer questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you have the budget numbers. How much are we spending on data now?
So it's less than 1/5 of 1% goes to the statistical agencies.
And so, an important policy question, I think, is whether that is adequate given the changing needs that are facing these agencies. To be very simple about it, we need more questions on some existing surveys. We need more information about alternative work arrangements. We need more information about people in the population with a criminal background. We need more information about a number of other things. Adding questions costs money.
That's right.
We need better data sharing. We need the ability to link administrative records with survey data. That also requires resources. If you look over the last 10 years, I believe, at least, the share of the federal budget that goes to these statistical programs has been pretty flat, which is, of course, is not true for every government program. It seems to me that there's a legitimate need for at least some increase in funding. Certainly, we wouldn't want to cut any funding, and that's something that I hope that this Congress and the administration can focus on.
I agree with you. The stakes are only getting higher. I think the economy is getting more complicated, and investing a little bit more in making sure that we continue to have the ability to measure these things well will really help.
Another important thing that may or may not require extra funding, the data aren't perfect.
No.
And in the enthusiasm about the data, it's important, I think, to recognize that. Maybe you have a few examples of some of the we've already touched on several. The data are kind of lagging behind societal changes. The data are lagging behind economic changes. Do you have any other examples of how the data really need to be improved?
Oh, sure. So. Source of a lot of debate among academic economists, and these are fun debates to be part of, is how much we're understating growth in output that is due to sort of computers, breakthroughs in computers. And so people have really done serious work to try to understand how much mismeasurement is there going on. I think some people are convinced that it's relatively small. Some people think it's much larger. I think no one thinks it's zero. And so what we need to be able to do is figure out ways to incorporate those into the statistics as they're measured today.
So basic stuff like productivity and output need to be improved.
Then we could sort of look backwards and think about when they updated how we collect inflation. If you might recall, there was this famous thing called the Boskin Report, maybe 20 years ago or so. And what it found was that we were doing a worse and worse job of measuring aspects of inflation because people would switch. Let's say you went to the grocery store and you saw that Golden Delicious apples were on sale, and so you'd switch from Gala apples to Golden Delicious. A switch like that was not well captured in the data. And at the same time, people were switching where they were doing their shopping from sort of, old style retailers to, big box stores or warehouse stores, et cetera. A serious bipartisan group came together, agreed that these are, different problems. I think they argued over what's the magnitude of this, but then, we came up with a serious bipartisan way to address it. And that is, I think, common in these statistical agencies. We know that it's hard to measure things and things evolve over time. But we want serious bipartisan efforts to just try to do the best we can so that we can all agree on the facts.
So things are good, but more work needs to be done.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.